Hello, thank you for joining us for today's Ask the Pet Food Pro. This series of expert chats is brought to you by Pet Food Forum and the editors of Pet Food Industry, the magazine and digital content provider with decades of providing the market with pet food expertise. You can find our content at petfoodindustry.com. Ask the Pet Food Pro offers a great opportunity to connect with pet food industry experts and ask the questions that are most on your mind. Today's chat is about sustainability in pet food ingredients, and it's supported by Ingredion. Thanks very much to them. And our expert today is Brian Nash, Vice President of Corporate Sustainability for Ingredion. Welcome, Brian. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Debbie.
Okay, so before we start the Q&A, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. First, you've all been muted to ensure everyone can hear and focus on the discussion, so please submit your questions or comments in the chat box. Some of you submitted questions beforehand, and we really appreciate those, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, along with the ones posted today. And finally, this chat is being recorded. We will have the recording ready in about a week at petfoodforumevents.com under the Ask the Pro tab. So with that, let's get into the discussion. First, I want to clarify that this is specifically about sustainability ingredients. So we're not talking about pet food ingredients in general in terms of nutrition and benefits and functions and things like that. It's about sustainability. So with that, Brian, can we please start with a basic why question, as in, why is sustainability in pet food ingredients important? What is your company's main reason for pursuing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few drivers for sustainability, but the biggest one is, I mean, we want to be able to continue to operate, an effective business years into the future. And so when we look at the why for doing sustainability, I think we've identified kind of 3 or 4 main value drivers. One is cost control. If we can, reduce energy consumption or things that go to our operating expense, that reduced our costs. There's risk mitigation. Obviously, companies are being increasingly held responsible for their supply chain. And so looking at risks that are in that supply chain, which could be human rights in terms of sourcing material, but it could be climate change impacts as well. I think the third value driver is brand enhancement. We look at where the work that we're doing, either enhancing the Ingredion brand or helping our customers to enhance their brand. That could be sustainable messaging that consumers are increasingly looking for. And then I think the fourth value driver for us is employee satisfaction or talent attraction and retention. More and more, I think there's a war for talent, particularly post-pandemic.
Yes.
And we're finding that talented new employees have their choice of where they want to go to work. And a lot of them want to be aligned with a company that has a good sustainability and ethical message.
That's interesting. I mean, I think it's true too, but you find that especially more with younger employees, or is that across the board?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot with younger employees, but I think we're even seeing it when we're looking at higher end talent. I mean, people just have more of a choice now in today's job market, and they're looking at multiple factors, obviously pay and the standard things that we look at, but they're also looking at, is it an industry I believe in or I'm passionate about, and then what is the company doing for society or the planet. And we're seeing that be a factor across the board, not just with young people, but especially with young people.
Interesting. And you mentioned, of course, the brand enhancement and the fact that consumers are more and more demanding sustainability or sustainable products. What kinds of trends, especially with ingredients, are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing like slightly higher than 70% of consumers are considering sustainability. I think maybe that number might be a little misleading. You're still going to have pockets of people that buy based on cost,
right? But
in looking at cost and what's affordable, they still can have their choice nowadays between, does a brand have a sustainable message or not? And so we're seeing that sustainability is becoming more and more of a factor. We're starting to see consumer goods companies with sustainability brand propositions seeing double-digit growth in some of those spaces. And so that all trickles down, right? So you've got the consumer demand, you've got the consumer goods facing companies supplying that sustainable demand, and then it's getting pushed down to companies like Ingredion at the ingredient space for helping our customers meet that demand.
Sure, sure. So it's a pull through
Yeah.
in some ways, and probably some push too, I would assume. Um, and so, you mentioned the 70% of consumers. Is that a US figure? Is that global?
It's a global figure
Okay.
that we're seeing. I would say it's being primarily driven out of Europe and the US. But we're seeing that increases in places like Brazil, in places like Japan. So it's not just US and European centric. There's pockets of this around the globe that are driving those numbers as well.
Yes, I just saw some research myself recently, I think from Nielsen IQ, showing some global figures along those lines. So one of the questions we want to get into is some of the challenges to sourcing, finding, using sustainable ingredients. We actually had a question come in that relates to that. So, talking about without regulatory guide rails, the sustainable sourcing environment seems very fluid, and projects, can vary in volume source, platform, project costs. So what are your goals for sourcing volumes, acceptable platforms, willingness to spend on sustainable raw materials? And, there's a lot of things that question covers, but I think it speaks to, what are some of the biggest challenges or things that you have to watch out for and that you think pet food companies should watch out for?
Yeah, the biggest, I'd say overall, just the overarching biggest challenge that we see and that we see with our customers is the complexity of sustainability. So as the question pointed out, there's no one regulation that says this is how the planet shall do sustainability, right? You've got guiding principles like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and you've got other frameworks out there for reporting. But there are lots of things people can be doing, and you can make up your own, which we deal with a lot, right? We have a lot of customers that say, because the consumers, there is a competitive differentiation factor. Not everybody wants to do the same program. So standardization is my friend, right? So, if I got, 100 customers asking me for sustainability or sustainably sourced ingredients, and they all want it slightly different, that's almost impossible to do, or I would say impossible to do for us. But if everybody says, oh yeah, we'll accept the same program or same standard, then it becomes, infinitely more doable. So I think that complexity is the biggest issue, and navigating through that complexity can be very challenging. So let me give an example to kind of explain what I mean. We had a customer come to us and say they wanted ingredients that were clean label, so meaning it's not chemically modified, non-GMO, and low carbon footprint. And I said, okay, well, clean label, because it's not chemically modified, is modified through physical means, which means it typically has a higher carbon footprint because it requires more input in processing. And non-GMO, in this case, was coming out of the US. So non-GMO corn tends to have a 7 or 8% higher carbon footprint than genetically modified corn. And so now you're saying, I want two things that are driving up the carbon footprint, and then I want low carbon footprint. And so we had a discussion with them to say, okay, I could buy renewable energy certificates, RECs, to offset that manufacturing, and that would raise your cost about, at the time, it was looking about 10 or 11%. And our market intelligence tells us that your consumers might pay 5 to 7% more for the low carbon footprint, but they're definitely interested in clean label and non-GMO. So are all of the things that you ask for must-haves, or are some of them nice to haves? And how do you want to navigate that? Because we're also bearing in mind, we are an ingredient in your overall product. Even if we give you everything ideally, you still have the rest of the product to contend with. Right. I think that is the biggest challenge we're seeing in sustainability is you've got corporate goals, you've got brand goals, you've got what consumers want, and trying to navigate, how do you bring value for the company? How can you help support growth and navigate this complex sustainability space where, increasing your human rights function or your support of human rights could have a negative impact on the carbon footprint, right? So we're looking at some things that we don't source in certain regions of the world because of human rights implications, but those regions happen to be the places with the highest yields and therefore the lowest carbon footprint. So you have a customer come in and say, hey, what can you do anything to lower the carbon footprint? And we go, well, I could source it from this region. And they go, no, not that. My brand can't handle, the human rights potential implication. So it's never as simple as just pulling one lever in sustainability. I think you have to look at the complexity across the board, and you've got to follow some of the market insight. You've got to follow some of the math on the carbon footprinting and how the ingredient plays into the overall product. And it makes it very complex. And I think people on the call today would be surprised at how many leading companies in sustainability in the world that are consumer facing have a request of their ingredient providers to help them navigate that space.
Yeah, it seems like there are a lot of trade-offs involved, and that's probably difficult for especially brands that really have a strong not only a strong eco-friendly messaging, but also that's some of them make that part of their mission or part of their overall strategy. You see more and more brands that are founded, especially including the pet food and treat space, that are founded on that concept of we're going to be planet friendly, and you just can't avoid the trade-offs, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd say especially the pet food industry, right? People love their pets.
Yes.
Guilty as charged, right? But I was helping some friends the other day, and I was amazed that the food they were feeding their kids, they didn't seem to be as scrutinizing about that as they were about the food they were feeding their pets, which I thought was really interesting. But I would also say it's indicative of a lot of people out there and how they feel about the food they feed their pets.
True. And I mean, the pet food does get somewhat of a bad rap, I think. And maybe some of that's deserved. I think there's also some research that's been out there that's not quite there's been pushback from people within the industry about whether the research that has been the most prominent and most quoted is really correct. I know a big study came out from a professor at UCLA several years ago, showing this huge footprint for pet food, and not really take into account the fact that a lot of the proteins are byproducts from the human food industry, which makes them more sustainable. It's helping a sustainable food chain. But anyway, I mean, I think that you're right. We're not going to quit feeding our pets and feeding them well, and we're not going to quit owning pets. And I mean, more and more pet owners are probably open to quote unquote alternative proteins, but those aren't at scale yet, or don't always provide the same nutritional benefits or what have you. So,
well, I think you're bringing up a good point, which is how do companies, when talking about sustainability, how do they combat the fact that they're competing against information that may come off of social media and may not have any scientific rigor. And my company struggles with that as well. I think the key is to tell your own honest message and have your own framework and stick to that, right? That's the best you can do, is to be transparent about your operations and help kind of combat the fact that nowadays anybody can say anything on social media and it may or may not get listened to.
Right. And, and have some kind of science behind it, or some kind of rationale for what your messaging is and what your methodologies are. Along those lines, someone said, we see customers using CI scores for comparison of ingredients. The question becomes, what methodology is used for life cycle assessments, and have your customers defined those methodologies for you? So I was going to actually ask about life cycle assessments, because that's one tool to use to get at all that complexity you were talking about earlier, correct?
Yeah. So life cycle assessment is one. It's funny, I'm actually doing a webinar tomorrow where we're talking about product carbon footprints and life cycle assessments. But I think of this as a pyramid, right? So there's 4 tiers. At the base, I would say, is academic data that I can provide to a customer. So what's the carbon footprint of corn? Okay, I can pull an industry, report and send you that. It doesn't need to be specific to Ingredion. The next tier up would be some company specific information. So if you want to know the carbon footprint of your product, I don't have metering on every aspect of our operations. So maybe I can or can't tell you that with some granularity, but what I can do is look at the overall site production and divide that by the overall site carbon footprint and give you an average carbon footprint per ton of production from that operation. So that's maybe slightly more specific than industry data. Above that tier, third tier up, I would say is software solutions, right? Things that require a little bit more input, but maybe aren't as quite as robust as a full-blown ISO validated life cycle assessment. And so then we're looking at tools like, we've used EcoChain for some customers have requested that. Some customers send us these super complex spreadsheets. They want us to fill them out. And we've used platforms like HowGood, which is a product sustainability database, which gives you water footprint, a carbon footprint, and other sustainability attribute information. And then above that, at the top tier, I'd say you have a life cycle assessment. Now, the challenge with a life cycle assessment is they are time consuming and costly. So we did one in one of our growth platforms around sugar reduction, and it was over $100,000 and took us 10 months to do it. So it's not something we have the resources to do in-house. And the companies I know that do it usually have a dedicated person or team working on that. So the question then becomes, in that pyramid, what is the right level of information that you need? For us, we kind of look at that third tier. We've joined this platform called HowGood, and it's giving a carbon footprint at the product level. It may not be 100% accurate all the time, but it's pretty good information. Now, if a customer came to us and said, I want to make an eco claim on my label, and I actually need a full-blown life cycle assessment, I think we would then look at that as a commercial discussion and say, okay, if we don't have that information, do you understand it's going to take time and resources? So we kind of talk to our customers and figure out what's the right level of information that you need. But I would say for a lot of companies out there, it's not practical to do a life cycle assessment on every product that you create. And even if it were, there's some complexity. One is that if anything changes in your life cycle assessment, then it potentially could invalidate that life cycle. So, right, your renewable energy mix switches, or you switch your sourcing area from one place to another on an ingredient, you could potentially invalidate that life cycle assessment. The other thing is life cycle assessments looking at carbon, water, and maybe waste. It's not telling you anything about animal rights. It's not telling you anything about labor scores. So there's a lot of attributes in sustainability that in some markets bring value and that aren't being picked up by an LCA. So that's how we look at it. It's complex, and it always starts with a discussion with the customer to say, what do you want to do with this information? We're starting to see companies put carbon footprints on products. I'd say it's more common to see some kind of sustainability statement on front or back of label talking about how they protect the environment, but starting to see that carbon footprinting. But honestly, it's going to require, I think, some consumer education, because right now, if there was a number on a product, I'd be hard pressed to tell you if it was a good number or a bad number, as somebody who's familiar with carbon footprints and life cycle assessments.
Right. And I mean, let's face it, there's already a lot of information on pet food packages already that's pretty confusing for consumers.
Absolutely.
So just one, just to delve just a little bit longer into the whole assessment. And so when you describe this pyramid, do most of your clients, so, most pet food treat companies, do they have the expertise internally to know where they want to be on that pyramid? Or is that part of your educational efforts?
Some yes, some no. Yeah, it's a mixed bag. Some of them know exactly what they want, and some of them come to us and say, here's the software platform we're using, take all your information and put it in. I mean, some of them are that complex or that sophisticated. Some of them come and say, I need to figure out the carbon footprint of my product. Can you give me the carbon footprint of your ingredient? And then we can have a discussion around, okay, is our system generated information enough? Do we need to do a full-blown LCA? Can we give you academic data? I think then it all comes into play to say, what are you trying to do with it? I mean, sometimes people are just trying to figure out the carbon footprint because they're trying to get their scope 1, 2, and 3 down and set
Right.
targets. That maybe requires a different level of information than I'm going to put something on the actual packaging of my product.
Right. And just real quickly, not to delve too much into the weeds on some of the guidelines and standards, but scope 1 and 2 and 3, those are from the UN principles, correct?
Yeah, I think just standard greenhouse gas accounting.
Right.
For anybody who's not familiar with it, scope 1 is any emissions that occur on your site. So if you run a dryer or something for a product, it has emissions. It's using electricity or some kind of fuel source. Scope 2 is your purchased energy. So it's, you purchased electricity off the grid, or you've got an on-site boiler would be scope 1, but yeah, so like your purchased electricity off the grid. Scope 3 is your supply chain emissions. So there's 15 different categories of scope 3, but it's going to be, agricultural sourcing, transportation, both from the farm to your site, or from your ingredient supplier to your site, as well as finished product being shipped out to, say, a retailer or something, travel, other logistical factors, downstream consumer use. So there's lots of different things in scope 3, and most companies' scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1 and 2. So there's a big element of double counting in there, and most companies are using a combination of actual data, what we would call primary data, and estimated data, which we call secondary data, to determine their scope 3. It's a super complex, particularly the more ingredients that you have in your product.
Sounds like it. I was just thinking that the level of complexity just, must multiply be multiple fold times, as you go up that scale. Just one more thing, and this is a very interesting question. Do you think AI could play a role in speeding up an LCA analysis, or another one of the kinds of analyses you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think look, AI is a really fascinating platform, and Ingredion, like a lot of companies, are trying to figure out how do we use this, but also put some guidelines and parameters. Right. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for AI to play in this space. I think it'd be really interesting to see what it could do with carbon footprint or water footprint information, given that there's a lot of sources out there that could be drawn upon. But I think there's also still some hurdles to how much do we trust that information.
Oh, yes.
I know we've played around with it. Right. So we've worked with some universities and had some students build out some platforms, and some of them were, what I'd call fairly successful, and some of them were not very successful. But in all reality, if I would say fairly successful is 75% accurate, there's no way I'm ever going to get my CFO to sign off on 75% accurate data. He wants a little more comfort level. Like, at least if we're doing estimates and calculations, he can understand the estimates and the assumptions, as opposed to AI went out there and kind of grabbed all this data and here's the result. I think, at least for us, for Ingredion internally, we have a lot of governance to put in place, a lot of understanding of how the tools would be working before I think we would fully sign off on using it for something like that.
Yeah, I think that's where everyone is, or hopefully it should be right now. I just saw an article, or headline. I didn't read the article, that ChatGPT is going to start allowing companies to, customize versions of their software, which, I mean, I guess if someone has the means and the know-how to bring something like that internally and figure out how to use it for their own needs, maybe that's the way to go.
Yeah, I said Skynet in a meeting of people talking about AI in our company the other day, and they're all a lot younger than me, so they all just looked at me like they didn't have any idea what I was talking about. But the one person my age in the room, laughed. But it's it's the artificial intelligence that destroys the world in the Terminator movies, and so I think that's the other thing is there's also just hurdles to there's hurdles to what people want to look at it for, and sometimes we're a little more conservative at the leadership level than the people working on the projects, and we got to get all that sorted out.
Yep, agreed. So let's switch gears a little bit. We had quite a few questions come in before the today, and then one now about some specific kinds of ingredients that may or may not be more sustainable. So one that comes up a lot is because it's quote, sorry for the pun, but it's gotten a lot of buzz, is insect protein. So is I think insect protein, the insect protein producers are making a pretty strong case for being more eco-friendly than some traditional proteins. But how does that play into the whole pet food and treat world?
Yeah, I think I think it's an interesting prospect. It's not Ingredion's not dealing with insect protein at the moment, at least. But I certainly think there is a sustainability play there. And I'm not an insect expert, but some insects I think are maybe even more sustainable than others. But it's certainly, when you're looking at land use, I think insects can be more efficient in that regard. Crickets, for example, I think need dedicated feed, if I understand that correctly. Whereas what is it, the black soldier fly larva? I'll never get that one right.
BSFL.
Yeah, BSFL. Look, my understanding is that they can take side streams from companies and use that as feedstock.
Yep.
That they require even less space per unit of output, and so the thing that I think makes that attractive from a sustainability standpoint is when you're looking at allocation of a carbon footprint, it is done on an economic or a financial level. So let me explain this. So Ingredion buys corn, among other crops, but I'll talk about corn. So we take corn and we split that into parts, right? So the starch of the corn is going into making food product, and then some of the other parts of the gluten and the other things are going into animal feed or pet care. And so based on the economic value of that is, and I'm going to speak hypothetically because it depends on what products you're talking about. But let's say that I sell out of $100 of sales, 80% of that goes to food and 20% of that goes into pet. That's how you allocate the carbon footprint. So you're allocating 20% of that carbon footprint is going into the pet food area. So on a black soldier fly larva, if you're taking a waste stream from a company as your feedstock, that waste stream may have, they may be paying the company that's growing the insect protein to take that waste stream, which means the economic value is now almost like negative, right? So you're going to get a tiny fraction of the carbon footprint of that source raw material. That ability to take that waste stream can then make that a very attractive from an environmental standpoint on the insect scale, right? What I'll say about this is then you've got all the other factors. So if the environmental footprint is your biggest driver, then that could be an attractive prospect. I think then it's when you would want to layer that information in with your consumer insights. So what do your consumers actually care about? Is it nutrition? And if so, does the insect provide that nutrition? Is it something else? Is it the overall sustainability of the company? Is it a human rights or an ethical sourcing message? So I think you have to look at what's the environmental benefit, and then does that layer up to a value proposition with your consumer or not? But from strictly an environmental standpoint, insect protein certainly has some benefits.
Right, and I think you're right. I think it's the scaling up to where they're affordable is kind of where that industry is, and where pet food and other uses for it might be. Um, so we have some questions about some other ingredients, and these are again would be more alternative types of proteins, for example, like single cell proteins, specifically fungal ones. I don't know if you have a lot of knowledge about those.
Yeah, I don't really have any knowledge in that space in terms of single cell proteins. I would say with any ingredient, scalability is going to be, I guess, a factor to look at. Regulatory approval is going to be a factor to look
Yes.
at. And I'm not a regulatory expert, but I can tell you at ingredients or Ingredion, when we're looking at ingredients, we have a whole team of people that are looking at, you can sell this product into this country, but you can't sell it into this country. And it is extremely complex. So I think the more you go down that road of alternate proteins, the more you have to look and see how it layers up into your market strategy in your company, right? If you're doing global distribution, maybe that makes it more complex to deal with. If you're sourcing locally and selling locally, okay, maybe it's less of a challenge. But I think those are the type of considerations I would be looking at if I was looking at like single cell protein or insects.
Okay, and then so someone asked about vegetarian pet food, and whether it's more sustainable. So what kinds of, not to get too much into Ingredion's business, but what kinds of alternative proteins are you offering to your customers, and how do those rank on the sustainability scale, if there is such a thing?
Yeah. So we're all plant-based, right? We don't do anything with animals. So we have plant-based proteins that come from like a yellow pea or other things. Look, in general, and I'm going to give you again, in general, one of the biggest contributors to the food industry's carbon footprint and water footprint, and the food industry is a big contributor to the global carbon footprint, but animal protein is a big contributor, in particular, beef or cattle. Those are big contributors to carbon footprint. So anytime you can look at an alternate protein like a yellow pea, I think you take away a lot of environmental considerations, or you reduce them dramatically. I would say the water footprint of a yellow pea versus beef, I'm just kind of remember, but I want to say it's like 26 times the water footprint for beef versus yellow pea, and the carbon footprint is probably at least 10 times, more, if maybe 20 times more. So you're dramatically reducing the carbon footprint and the water footprint when you're looking at that. I think then there's also a cost factor. Sometimes plant-based proteins can be cheaper. And sometimes not. Sometimes we're dealing with customers that are very interested in hybridization. So can they buy a system? So not just a plant-based protein, but maybe a starch also that includes some water absorption or something that gives more of a fatty mouthfeel when it's being eaten, and maybe that makes it more, I think, just a more palatable texture. That comes maybe more into play on the food side than it does on the pet care side, but I think still comes into play. So yeah, from an overall standpoint, in general, I won't say this, every time, but in general, you're going to look at a significantly lower environmental footprint on a plant-based protein. And depending on how you're formulating with it, some potentially good cost reduction implications as well.
True. Yeah, I do think, just as an aside, I do think mouth texture is very important especially for cats.
Yeah.
And of course the palatability is a huge issue with pet food. The other thing that you mentioned, and I'm blanking on what it was. Just the fact that a vegan, cats can, I think there's more and more research coming out that cats can be fed a vegetarian food, even though they're, obligate carnivores. They really need some animal protein. I think there's companies figured out a way around that, but there's the fact that, it's not an easy thing to do to make sure a cat stays healthy. Dogs are more omnivores. They can have, they can survive better. And I know that I said that we weren't going to get into the nutrition of too much of ingredients in this discussion, but I mean there is that element you have to look at when you're looking at some of these more sustainable ingredients, I think.
Well, I'll say this on the food side. I think hybridization is becoming more attractive. So we're seeing animal protein companies that are under pressure from investors to have a climate, mitigation strategy. Mm-hmm. And hybridization is a way that they could potentially, and I don't know the numbers on specific formulations, but if you could, put in 15% plant protein blended in with meat, you've got a potential to drop down considerably on your carbon footprint or have a pretty good impact. And then the other thing is on the food side, again, I don't know I haven't looked at it specifically on the pet care side, but on the food side, you're getting companies charging a premium for hybridization. So when I was a kid and I was in school, you had soy burgers where they blended hamburger with soy because it was cheaper. And that's what they fed kids. But now, I go to the store if I want to buy a box of burgers, which is not what my kids want. They want the hybrid or the plant-based. I'm paying a premium for those things. Yes. And I'm thinking that the ingredients are cheaper, but I'm paying more. And I know there's more to it than just the ingredients, right? There's the R&D and all the other things that go into that. But, I don't know, maybe there's an opportunity in the pet industry to look at hybridization and could that help mitigate, or help enhance the climate mitigation strategy of the company, give consumers what they want, which is a little bit higher plant-based in the overall food, but still give animals anything specific they might be getting out of the animal protein.
Good point. And the interesting part of that is that for a long time, prevailing consumer trends related to dog food especially had to be like meat first, high protein, meat first on the label. I want to feed my dog like a wolf would eat. Never mind that wolves eat the entire contents of a thing, so there's plants in there. But anyway, so I think there is starting to be a subtle shift because of sustainability and probably cost because of the high inflation of pet food these days. But I think there is, I don't know, maybe somewhat of a shift of pet owners understanding that maybe that meat first, besides the fact that it isn't necessarily, my dog doesn't necessarily have to have 55%, meat to be healthy and very, to really thrive, but also, it's just not sustainable,
Yeah. My neighbor's beagle is like 40 pounds, right? It's rounder than it is long. And it probably doesn't need as much food as it's getting. So it probably doesn't need as much meat content as they're giving it. So I guess that's the other thing to look at is can you give a protein content and blend that with a plant-based or something. I would guess like most Americans, our pets are probably overfed too. So
yes, pet obesity is definitely an issue that could be its own topic for a Zoom chat, I think. This is kind of going back a little bit to the beginning of the discussion almost, but because we were talking about different standards and different views of sustainability around the world. But do you have a definition for a sustainable ingredient that you follow?
Yeah, look, we look at sustainably sourced. We follow what's called the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative platform. It's probably the leading sustainable ag program for the food and beverage industry. So we're using that. That has like 17 different categories. There's like 115 questions that are asked at the farm level. Some of those are social questions. Some of those are financial questions. So a lot of them are environmental questions. We're looking at that kind of holistic and industry standard when we're defining what is a sustainable ingredient. Now, on top of that, we are trying to look at things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so how do we layer in any of those considerations into the ingredients that we make? So just like we just talked about pet obesity, which is maybe not what a bunch of people that sell pet food want to hear, but is there too much salt in, or sugar or other things going into pet diet, which is considerations, for people at a planetary level as well. So I think there's a lot of overlap in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we start with an industry baseline for saying this is a sustainable ingredient. And then we look at how can we evaluate the other attributes on top of that. And then more importantly, align those with the needs of our customers or their consumers.
So in other words, that's pretty a complex thing too.
It's complex, and I mean we have customers that metric shifts between brands within the same company.
Wow.
So one brand within a customer's company may be focused on the ethical part of it, and another brand might be focused on the environmental part of it, and so it's having a robust system or having a standard that we start with at least gives us a starting point. So if somebody comes in for an ethical discussion, we know exactly what's already in the box or already in the bag, from the point that the product's made, and then we can kind of discuss what they need from there. And that may be a different ingredient. That may be an ingredient system. It may mean that we process it in a different way. So I think it's all open for discussion. But what I would say to everybody on the call is figure out what makes sense for your own company and pick a standard, right, that you want to start with, and use that as at least your true north. Because otherwise the shifting demand of consumers or other companies, you're like a cork bobbing in a violent ocean. You'll get pulled 9 different ways, 20 different ways all the time. So understanding what actually makes sense for your company, either to drive value or reduce cost or mitigate risk, setting that standard and using that kind of as your true north. And then when we deviate from there, it's a commercial discussion, right? If you see value in doing something differently than Ingredion does, we can talk about what it takes to get there and what that means.
Okay. So you mentioned the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative platform. Is that the name?
Yeah.
Someone's asking for a link. So imagine if you Google it, that would be pretty easy.
It's saiplatform.org.
Okay. There we go. Thank you. And that sounds like someone asked, that's the one that's kind of your first go-to.
It is, because before we joined that platform, we had 12 customers asking us to do their own programs for sourcing. And we made no progress because it was always an internal debate about who we started with, and we joined SciPlatform. We said, okay, there's, 150 food and beverage companies that are members of this, but we said it's an industry standard. It's a starting point. And we've been making, significant progress. So we're, last year, I think we're at 48% of our sourcing being sustainable under that program. Looking to get to about 2/3 of it by this year, about 100% by 2025.
Great.
So
okay.
picking a standard has allowed us to accelerate our progress.
Okay, good. And I just put that link that Brian gave in the chat box, everyone. Let's see. So going back to some specific ingredients, and you mentioned the hybridization and combining plants with animal proteins, perhaps, all the grains. So, we went through this whole big DCM, grain-free food is bad controversy and spectacle a few years ago. And some brands switched more to grains and, really focused on ancient grains. So are any of those more sustainable that like quinoa or amaranth or ones like that?
Yeah, I mean, they can be, right? So I would say, when you're looking at ingredients, obviously you've got things traditionally like rice that have a higher water footprint, although I've seen some pretty innovative ways to sustainably source rice that are nice, and some of those are suppliers we work with. So you're going to have a hierarchy, right? You're going to start with rice, maybe has a bigger environmental footprint, come down through things like wheat to corn, and then get down lower than that to like peas and maybe your quinoas. So there's definitely a hierarchy in grains or crops, and plenty of sources online where you can go out and kind of get a feel for what that hierarchy looks like. But what I'll say this is it all depends, right? It's not as simple as just saying, well, peas have the lowest carbon footprint because they sequester nitrogen from the atmosphere and don't require as much fertilizer. So I'm going to go to all peas. It depends on where you're sourcing it. It depends on how far you're transporting it from where you're sourcing it. If you were looking at something that's only sourced in China, but your operations are in North America, okay, your transportation footprint is likely to be the bigger part of that issue than your agricultural footprint. So they all have to be considerations. And what I would tell anybody in my space is follow the math. Start by getting your numbers in front of you and look at it and say, okay, yeah, it looked like quinoa was going to be the right, was going to be the right ingredient, but where we would have to source it from to make it cost effective means that we're kind of killing that environmental footprint message. And so you got to play around with it, right? It's cost, it's distance, it's how much does the carbon footprint actually add to the value of the end product. So how much do you want to focus on that in a decision factor in what ingredients to use?
Yeah. Okay. Back to that complexity. So back to the SIA platform, someone mentioned it doesn't include carbon footprint in its criteria. Is that the case?
So I'd say yes, that's accurate. It looks at factors that contribute to on-farm carbon emissions, but they are about to roll out a regenerative ag standard that has a metrics component to it. And so I think there's going to be mechanisms for getting on-farm carbon footprint. I know Side Platform's closely aligned with Cool Farm Tool, which can help people get an on-farm carbon footprint. It's been benchmarked to things in the US like Field to Market, which have a field print calculator and can give you an on-farm carbon emission. So it's aligned with a lot of standards that can help you if that's what you're trying to do to get an on-farm carbon footprint. And certainly reach out to Ingredion if you have questions. We can maybe point you in the right direction, help you navigate what makes the most sense for you.
Okay, great. This is an interesting question in terms of sustainability. Do you see greater opportunities in pet treats versus pet foods?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Because it's kind of like snacking on the food side. It's an indulgence. So I guess what I would do is look at the market research and see, are people willing to pay more for treats because they're buying less of them? And if that's the case, then yeah, maybe there is an opportunity in treats to have some kind of eco label on there or something, or some kind of sustainability messaging. But yeah, I mean, I would say it's definitely should be in the scope of what companies are looking at. And because people are not buying it as much as say the pet food, then there might be a willingness to pay more for something that has the right brand messaging.
True. And treats are definitely a high growth category for both cats and dogs. So yeah, good points. So kind of getting out the crystal ball, what is your opinion on the future of sustainability for pet food ingredients?
Yeah, look, I think we're already seeing the shift from our customers asking about ways to minimize carbon footprint, ways to make sure that there's ethical sourcing. I think we see pet food going the same way as people food, in that you're going to see factions of the market that are willing to pay more, and therefore there's a growth opportunity, right? So I talked with one customer that said, look, if my consumers are willing to pay a premium for this, I can get double-digit growth for my company without making any more product, which is an interesting growth prospect, right? I can make the same amount of product, but I can increase my profits by making sure that what's going into that product layers up to a branding or a sustainability message. And I think companies are starting to see that. And the more companies break into that space, the more you'll see the industry follow. And we're already starting to see it. So,
but how much do you think the current inflationary picture plays a role in that? Because I mean, it's pet food was one of the categories that was hit hardest by inflation, and the inflation rate starting to come down, but some of those prices are still pretty high, which not every pet owner can afford. So you think that's a mitigating factor, or it's just kind of a cycle that we have to work through, or?
I think it's more cyclical. I think that there's more reasons than just the cost on the package to look at sustainability. I think the pandemic also showed us that people didn't understand their supply chains, and people didn't know where things were coming from, even though they thought they did. And now people are understanding that, okay, now that I know where it's coming from, there's a climate impact. Are my costs going to go up in the future if I'm buying something that's not sustainable and therefore not resilient to climate change impacts? We're starting to see that level of questioning into the traceability of ingredients. And so I think we're going to see the sustainability trend, whether or not the consumers always bear out, the higher prices for it. I think at the end of the day, companies making these products are still going to have a need to be able to say to investors, or to be able to mitigate cost or risk, or have a better comfort level on their supply chain. I don't think you're going to see that trend go away.
No, I don't think companies are going to pull back, for all the reasons you just gave.
Yeah,
I think
they may at a brand level choose to say, okay, I'm not going to go with this ingredient, even though it lowers the carbon footprint, because it's slightly more expensive and I need to have an affordable brand for that faction of my consumer base. I think you'll see that constantly shift, right? Where people put more production into one line versus another, and that'll ebb and flow with things like inflation. But yeah, I don't see it going away, and I don't see it dramatically shrinking anytime in the future.
Good to know. Good to know. Any further words of advice for people on the call, for companies, looking to either really dive into the sustainability space, or just enhance what they're already doing?
Yeah, a couple of things, right? One, I would say talk to your suppliers. Make sure you're working with suppliers that can help you, I guess, navigate that journey, because they're going to have a lot of information that you don't, and you're going to have a lot of information that they don't. And it's really critical to bring those things together in a conversation so that the suppliers know what you're trying to do, so they can say, well, maybe you ought to consider, this ingredient versus that ingredient. I think it's just really critical. We unlock a lot of potential when we get the right people in the room and have those discussions. So I say that's one. Two is figure out what makes sense for your organization, right? Don't try to boil the ocean and do everything. And I told my executive team, we could be doing 2,000 things in sustainability. I just want to do 20 of them that bring value to our company, our shareholders, and our customers, right? So I don't need to boil the ocean. I need to be very, start small and grow. And then the third thing I would say is follow the math. Get yourself some data on what your consumers are willing to pay for. Get yourself some environmental footprint information. Look at what your investors are asking for, what your competitors or customers are talking about in this space, and then start getting some data in your own operations to help you figure out what does it actually make sense to work on, and where should I start, right? So if you were looking at an ingredient that's 1% of your overall product versus an ingredient that's 50%, that one's really easy for people to figure out, right? That's a no-brainer. Start with the 50%. But it can be the same type of lens when you're looking at your company carbon footprint, or trying to figure out, how do I do something in sustainability that's going to speak to my consumer base? We'll figure out what your biggest consumer base is, and figure out if that's the group where you see the most growth, or do you see the most potential for growth or cost increase in a different segment of your consumer base, and then figure out what would it take to work in that space. So.
Okay, thank you. Another question just came in. This may be somewhat off topic or outside your area of expertise, but it's asking about PFAs, the hormone disrupting chemicals that are often used in packaging. Is that something that you know much about, or that Ingredion,
Yeah, I don't know much about PFAs, other than the only thing I can say around packaging is I think that whole sustainable packaging is a space that's getting explored.
Yes,
a lot of companies have made science-based target commitments, and they're trying to figure out how to reduce their packaging impact. And we're seeing a lot of we're getting a lot of demand from packaging companies that say, can you give us a cornstarch film that gives us a barrier on a paper bag or on a cardboard container? Or so yeah, I would say there's definitely packaging innovation coming, and it's just a matter of probably finding the right packaging company to work with on eliminating any kind of chemicals or products of concern in that.
Interesting. Yeah, I know that there's a lot happening, as you said, in the packaging area, and a lot of research being done. I didn't even think about the fact that packaging companies will be coming to a company like Ingredion for help with plant-based materials. Interesting.
We have a whole industrial part of the business that's growing because of that type of business.
Wow. Lots of exciting stuff. So one last question. Do you see sustainability as a competitive differentiator, or is it one of those issues that is so important that companies should be sharing data and information and best practices and all that, regardless of their competitive status?
Yeah, you asked the wrong guy. I would never say it's not a competitive differentiator. It's how I convince them to keep paying me. So look, here's the answer to that question. The answer is it's both, right? I think there are so in our company we have 9 elements under our sustainability program, which have lots of sub elements. We don't say that every single one of those is a competitive differentiator. Some of them we do them because they're the right thing to do. We work in the communities and have community impact because it's the right thing to do, not because we think anybody's going to be like, wow, Ingredion build a playground at that school, we should buy more product from them. So there's some things that we say, okay, we can collaborate in this space. And then there are some that we've identified where we think there is a competitive differentiation. So again, just like you're narrowing your focus, I say out of your sustainability program, if you have 5 things, maybe only 1 or 2 of them need to be a space where you're looking to be competitively differentiated. But I would start with a narrow focus and say, okay, this is the thing I want to be different than, and figure out what that takes, and then scale up from there. So I think it's both, right? Some of it's just cost of doing business, right thing to do, and then some of our spaces where you can really differentiate.
Good way to think about it. Well, thanks very much, Brian. I think people got a lot out of the call. One person commented that he really appreciated that you were honest and forthright about some issues. So really appreciate that. And thank you to Ingredion again for your support today. Thank you for everyone for listening in. To continue your learning on this and other topics, we do have a lot of webinars coming up still through the year and into next year, and also more Ask the Pet Food Pro chats. We also have registration open for Pet Food Forum, where we will be discussing sustainability and ingredients and all kinds of topics. We'd love your feedback on today's chat. So if you can please use the QR code on the screen, or we also will be sending out an email shortly after this with a link. So please give us your feedback. And finally, just a reminder that this has been recorded, and we will have the recording ready within a week or less at petfoodforumevents.com under the Ask the Pro tab. One last plug for you, Brian. Someone asking where and who your LCA webinar is with tomorrow.
Yeah, it's being sponsored by the platform I mentioned, HowGood.
Okay.
So I would say go out to howgood.com and look and see if there's a link out there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again. Thanks to everyone for participating, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day or evening.